Good evening and welcome to the West 86th lecture, which is an annual event in which we invite a leading scholar to give a talk on some aspect of their research that will ultimately be published in West 86th, a journal of decorative arts, design history and material culture that I hope you all know about, published by the University of Chicago Press. My name is Paul Sturton and I'm the editor of West 86th, and I should also draw attention to Dan Lee over in the corner here, who is the managing editor and who handles all our academic publications. Now, in the past, speakers at this event have included Deborah Silverman, David Friedberg and Christina Lauder, and it's given rise to some of our most important articles in the journal, notably one on Belgian Art Nouveau and the legacy of the Congo, and more recently on the textile industry in revolutionary Russia. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Esther Leslie, Professor of Political Aesthetics at Birkbeck in the University of London, a scholar whose work I've admired for many years. In a way, the very title of political aesthetics might sound odd in New York, and yet in Central Europe and the period and region which Esther's work is concerned, political and aesthetics seem to be frequently almost interchangeable. Indeed, they seem to be a necessary corollary of one another. Esther's books include various studies and translations of Walter Benjamin, including Walter Benjamin, Overpowering Conformism from 2000, Walter Benjamin, Critical Lives from 2007, and the edited collection Walter Benjamin on Photography from 2016. But she doesn't work exclusively in this area. She's also published Hollywood Flatlands, Animation, Critical Theory and the Avant-Garde, or Synthetic Worlds, Nature, Art and the Chemical Industry, and most recently, Deeper in the Pyramid, which is produced with Melanie Jackson. Well, her talk tonight, as you can see, is going to be on devices and the designs on us. So please join me in welcoming Esther Leslie to the Bard Graduate Centre.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. My talk is slightly odd. My work has become maybe slightly odd of late. There's a lot of images, so I guess you'll mostly be looking that way, but the images are kind of, they're illustrations, commentaries, maybe sometimes ironic slants on what I'm saying. And I think what I'm going to do is a kind of poetic evaluation of the politics of materials, of how they're present in the world, how certain materials have always been present in the world, but what happens to those materials in our contemporary digital device-driven economy. So I start with the section called Dust of History, which is a kind of introduction and place setting where I want to outline something larger before we hone in on the idea of the device. So what happens at the end of time? They say dust falls on it, and everything gets covered in a layer of dust. And you can see the outlines of things, but not the substance. There's also a silence or a muffling. We say that dust settles on things. The collapse of states in the Eastern Bloc, 1989, led for a short time to declarations of the end of history and a new world order. It was as if scores were settled. The dust had settled. Things were different. The fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, became synonymous with the end of one epoch and the opening of another. So the wall fell and its concrete slabs, steel loopholes inside, but covered in these concrete slabs, all crumbled away to dust or was hammered into dust. The granules of sand that had been bound up in this structure might have split off and been spilt again were they not, or had they not been chemically transformed. In the early days of the fall of the wall and the end of history, events were widely conceived of as first and foremost a kind of media event. A televisual spectre of triumphant wall breakers, images of the crumbling authority of dictators, and the removal of statues. And such images returned again and again, ever rebroadcast to replace or stand in for, perhaps, historical process or its cessation. But dust fell on the end of history idea. Almost immediately, history reasserted itself. If history is change, violence, disruption, wars began. Empires clashed and fought, and there was much bloodshed. And it all seemed less like an end and more like an eternal return of the ever same, an endlessness. These battlefields of operation were dusty, and they were not fields, but deserts, deserts of sand in which storms occurred. Sandstorms and dust storms clogged the lungs of soldiers, blinded the enemy. Dust, sand, a matter that's present, determining, constitutive and significant in two events, in this wall fall and in these wars, two events that might be seen to inaugurate an epoch that has not yet ended and cannot, because it is the time of eternal returns, of histories that are not progressive, but stuck in neutral or even in reverse. In Walter Benjamin's reports on fantasies expressed in 19th century France, passed through his arcades project of the 1920s and 30s, dust is prevalent, and it appears as a layer that settles on a privileged class that is arrested in time, a class that may wish to hold up all the forces of change and revolution, to be indeed the last class, the culmination or end of history, again. And that wish reasserts itself. Dust cannot be escaped, and it will come to be an emblem of something, and still is. So that dust can fall and claim that it's the end of history, but these ends just keep reoccurring. In 2014, the world's biggest steelmaker, ArcelorMittal, dismantled a monument to Vladimir Lenin outside one of its steel plants at Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine. This was in response to the destruction of Lenin monuments by protesters who had just forced the country's president to flee. The reason for dismantling given by ArcelorMittal was in order to ensure the safety of our employees and protect the company's buildings. Now, the statue of Lenin outside the steelworks in Ukraine was not a realization of Lenin's own plan, 1918 plan for monumental but temporary propaganda. It was rather its negation, the negation that Stalin saw through. We can set this off. Go play. Oops. Help. I'm not very good at doing this. Oh, what did I do? Help. Someone want to... I'll just keep reading, because it's film footage from Eisenstein's movie where they dismantle the statue of the Tsar. So there's much that can be said about the erection and dismantling of statues. and about how the memorial substitutes for memory or becomes a kind of blind spot of history, freezing history as power, especially as it freezes into history, standing there through the ages as the dominating presence of domination. The ArcelorMittal removal of Lenin's monument, unlike the dismantling as part of street upheaval, was an act of power stepping in to interrupt the discursivity, including violent discursivity of the streets, in the name of protecting property relations as they exist. What wild turns is history subject to? The putting up of a particular statue is just the same as taking it down. It's a reversible history. That's to say, running forwards or backwards, it amounts to the same. Power building up, power taking down, another power building up. All is symbol, a performance in front of a site where something, not history, is made. Dust falls on history. History whirls up dust and moves on, forwards and backwards. But this is dust as metaphor. Dust is also a factor in the world, or a problem in our world. The production of steel makes dust. Like much industrial processing, ArcelorMittal makes so much dust. Near one site, it appears in huge stockpiles, some 20 metres high. These cover the area the size of 56 football pitches. Cancer rates there amongst children are elevated. As one newspaper report puts it, red and black dust from parks of iron ore and coal have long covered balconies and playgrounds in nearby Tamburi and Paulo, 6 neighbourhoods, and locals shut themselves in and schools close when the wind blows their way. So what winds of history are these bearing dust? So dust is not just an emblem, it's a pollutant. History might become nature too. In the Middle East, as a result of climate change, the number and intensity of sand or dust storms is apparently increasing. A contemporary artist has provided images of dust and sand, clogging, blinding, ending things but not starting anything new, a portentous cloud that kills, an art dust that is real and unreal. His dust makes images of an ever return of historical catastrophe, which is currently conceptualized as a war on environment and on people. The artist, John Gerard, brought trickily into being video composite clouds of dust that represented the inaugurating clouds of an epoch of wars in the oil-rich Middle East. Over the last decade, Gerard has produced a series of what he calls animated scenes. 2 of the first of such scenes, representing clouds of dust or sand, were called Dust Storm Dallat, Texas, and Dust Storm Manta, Kansas. These were from 2007, and they combined an archival photograph of a dust cloud in the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s with photographs and films of areas of landscape in Texas and Kansas, together with satellite and topographical data. And what appears to be a film or a video, this is moving, is actually a simulated world animated into being and developed out of real-time computer graphics as used by the military and the gaming industry. The cloud of brown dust, a sandy cloud, static on the photograph, was animated by Gerard into a whirling storm cloud using digital tools. And the storm cloud's patterns of swirl are reportedly based on the churns of dust or desert storms caught on video by soldiers, American soldiers serving in Iraq, as they used the new technologies for self-representation to convey back home what they saw and experienced in the historyless wars after the end of history, or the wars that would bring the last ideology, liberal capitalism, through the barrel of a gun or a cruise missile. In making this a link is drawn by Gerard between two environmental disasters: the massive oil fields in the southern states and the use of oil-fueled mechanized agriculture, on the one hand, produced an environmental disaster in the 1930s. The presence of oil in late 20th century military adventures produces another one. The dust clouds eddy amidst their composite northern Texas and Kansas scenery under the diurnal conditions of real-time Dalat and Manta, emerging into view in a 360-degree pan that takes 8 minutes before the camera passes back to the blank horizon again and again, following the day, the night, the months, the years. It's a simulation then of some moments which took place on Sunday, 14th of April 1935, when the dust clouds were at their worst, 1,500 miles wide and half a mile high. On that bleak day, under the thickest dust cloud, across 100 million acres of land, cattle were choked and blinded. People were driven out, suffering dust pneumonia and suffocation. Areas were devastated. These moments are made by the animated scene into a day, that Black Sunday, in which the world is not as it should be. The cloud is on the ground. The cloud has been brought down to earth and is of earth, of dusty topsoil, loosened and made airy dry by the ripping out of native grasses for the massive farming of wheat. This dust cloud is a threatening cloud that looms in a sublimely devastating way. In its manufactured nature, though, it resembles another once new cloud, a cloud that comes about historically, as defined in John Ruskin's storm cloud of the 19th century. The cloud of sand, in this case, in this other case that Gerard brings into the image, is a cloud of war, a landscape whipped up into weapon in the tussles of imperial fighting. The dust that fell at the end of history is one that contained within each grain all of history and intimations of what was to come, the world in a grain of sand or in a mote of dust. Sand is dust, a collation of particles. It's a dust, especially when it's whipped up by wind, including the winds of history or the storm of progress or the storm of eternal return. Sand is the stuff of the desert, the dust of rocks, a landscape for war. A cloud of sand is captured and made concrete too. It's found its way into buildings in the form of concrete, a mixture of sand, gravel and rocks glued together by cement paste made of water and cement powder. Sand was essential to the post-war buildings that emblematize capitalist modernity. This universal architecture, an international form that imagined it could be the buildings to be found at the end of history and the end of ideology. In every space, in an international environment that is nowhere and everywhere at once, and this is made of sand. There's sand too in the glass of its windows. This concrete architecture accompanied an era of social welfare in the West and communism in the East. Each side championed its universal rights and liberation in functionalist buildings made of concrete and glass. It was also the material of more banal and more exclusive private corporatist developments. It still is. And in the post-Cold War epoch, technologists are trying to find a way even to make concrete on the moon in conditions of low gravity in preparation for permanent human settlement. Since the 1980s, it's been proposed that moon rock or lunar regolith simulant materials could form lunarcrete or mooncrete. And this year, in the volcanic Eifel region of Germany, where the rock is close to lunar rock, scientists have heated lunar regolith simulant in a microwave oven and found it was possible to manufacture a variety of basaltic or silicate glasses, which can then make mirrors manufactured of material then found on the lunar surface, which might be arranged in an array to deflect incident sunlight to either a shadowed region or concentrated in another area, making the moon habitable. The moon become mirror, become glass, become sand and dust. The moon is our mirror. Earth and moon separated billions of years ago. Earth made layer after layer of dust, of soil, of organic material. The moon is as if the Earth's inside spilled outwards. Space was a frontier in the Cold War. Now it's one for usually private capital. New dusts, new minerals will allow for colonization, for realization of the recurrent dreams of conquest. New dusts will be made. Also, new dusts from the oldest parts, from the start of things. We've pulverized this planet thoroughly. We need to find more powders. Sand and gravel are now the most extracted materials in the world. They are globalized commodities whose trade value has increased sixfold or more in the last 25 years. In 1994, the registered use of concrete, for which much of this sand is traded, was 1.4 billion tonnes a year. By 2016, it was up to 4.6 billion tonnes. These amounts keep expanding. There's more concrete by mass, apparently, on our planet than there are trees and bushes. Sand mining has changed coastlines and rivers and produced vulnerability to floods, storm surges and erosion, and still pools of water, vulnerable to the generation of disease with the attendant effects on habitat. Construction sand, emblematic of progress, is now in short supply. It is scarce. It's an emblem and a victim of a politics of extractivism and over-exploitation of a natural resource amidst rampant building for private interests, including the construction of new territories, artificial islands. Progress is halted or can be carried on only at a massive cost to the environment, and so is nothing like progress, or it is the wrong sort of progress. The 300% increase in the use of concrete over the last 20 years gives an image of the dispersion of concrete in parallel to the same epoch as we have the diffusion of the digital, an apparently immaterial epoch. So the concrete accompanies the abstract, it would seem. We're compelled to think about matter on the point of its actual and metaphorical disappearance. The fall of the wall, the breaking of statues, the inauguration of wars, the extractive assault on environments, the start and end of welfare states, of communism and social democracies. These are our times. I found them in grains of sand. What John Gerard makes visible in his complex rendering of late 20th century, early 21st century environmental and political concerns includes something else, as visible here too in his piece from 2017, Western Flag, Spindletop, Texas. This depicts the site of the Lucas Gusher, the world's first major oil find from 1901, a resource which is now barren, exhausted. The site is digitally simulated and marked by a virtual flag of perpetually renewing black smoke. This is a diagnosis of a recurrent and destructive past which erupts into the present. A material, oil, is the organizer or motif, but another matter literally clouds the scene. It's a gas of dark particulates. The whole artwork relies on a set of technologies that have accompanied this new epoch, this one that has emerged over the last 20 years, in effect, swept in and over us like a cloud, or exists over us as a cloud or as a fog. It's the cloud or fog of computing. This fogged world is predicated itself on grains of sand, of dust and sand become glass, become screen, become touch screen. It's a digital epoch, a liquid crystal one. All that swirling dust, those mineral quests and conquests, have come together in an epoch of digital capitalism with its devices. Dust, sand, granules are gathered together, subjected to heat, hardened into glass, a glass that is not to be seen, but through which is seen the compelling spectacle of contemporary life. While through it, too, but in the other direction, we are constantly seen, known, or tracked, like blowing grains of dust, a mass of particles, acting or not. This dust that is sand is captured and made invisible, but it's crucial in each of our devices that we hold so close. And now sand makes our world, from the largest to the smallest parts of it. It's at our fingertips all the time, in the form of silicon, in the form of glass. We know the feel of those screens better than we know the contours of our lovers, I would bet. We spend so long not only looking at them, but touching them, feeling them. And we keep the dust off them, or try to, and our grease. We care for them. And they, like everything else, envelop us in a turbulent atmosphere in which there is a kind of dust, but it's invisible to us. But we call it fog. The fog of data streams, the results of communications between everything that is unwired into our Internet of Things. These streams, its streams, are not streams, but atmospheres, foggy environments which convey data. And some call this digital dust, these fallings off, these traces, these little bits and pixels of past work, thought, and actions. Digital photography, or digital information systems, as the artist Jeff Wall called them in his early and premature reflections on the shift from analog to digital photography in 1984, engage and disengage with matter in the world in particular ways. Digital photography aims to redouble the efforts of chemical photography to overcome wetness, to keep the camera and its processes dry, to hold water far from the production process in some distant and imperceptible electricity plants that cameras rely on to charge. Through this, the photography that is a product of the liquid crystal age becomes dehydrated, drier than dust. As atmospheric science finds ways to map, measure, and optically diagrammatize the paths of swirling dust in turbulence patterns of sandstorms on the moon or particulate pollution as it moves over cities, as it makes out of these movements of dust and particles the gentle sweep of arcs in compound curvatures, it posits a relation to the fragility or transience of the phenomena it apprehends. Digital image making, like digital devices, is drawn to the dust, to particulate, finding ways to make detectable evanescence, such as the stress factors on a curve, the agitation of the air, clouds, the wind. It turns them into outputs, into measurement, as in the von Karman vortex streets, which Jeff Wall mentions, made by NASA's multi-angle imaging spectroradiometer device. Dust's movements can be tracked in digital mapping programs, visualized, analyzed. And the turbid dust of a polluted region or sand on the move, is mapped and tracked digitally. Its future moves predicted as particulate marries with pixels and digital visualization pairs with analysis. The dispersion of the virtually imperceptible, its behaviors over time, its pixelated parades are brought to light. The digital age draws in dust as it makes every effort to repel it. Dust has always been one of the plagues of photography. Dust on negatives, dust on lenses, inside cameras. It's even more irritating in the digital world. The electrical charges within cameras draw dust particles in like magnets, and these dust spots will appear in every image thereafter. And digital photography is also especially susceptible to backscatter or retroreflection of light off dust or other particles in air or in water. These appear as orbs of transparent white or rainbow circles floating in the image. Dust is data too now. Facebook builds knowledge of social relationships and has been known to make its lucrative people you may know suggestions by correlating the dust on photographs, indicating that various images were taken by the same camera. Yet dust remains a problem, or an emblem for a problem, in digital surveillance capitalism. If you take the deep learning out of Facebook today, Facebook's dust. LeCun, Facebook's chief AI scientist, recently told CNN Business. It's entirely built around it now. The matter phase of the digital age is an attraction to an atmosphere rich with dust, which is often, if only almost, visible. It's always measurable. Those sands on the move, those tiny particulates of pollution balling in our cities, those specks of toxicity that bunch at the poles of the world. Digital devices track those dusty whirls of tiny movements and make them useful to science and measurement. And the erratic that was at photography's birth, as Walter Benjamin identified it, returns otherwise, not as the mist of an imperialism happy to be named such and through which subjects peer, but rather in the clouded air of industrial farming's dirt tracks, the loss of topsoil from irresponsible changes in land use, the increase in pollution. The military knows about dust, this smart dust, about how this swirl of tiny matter could be tiny electronic spies, pixelish electronic wads of power, sensors, computing and communications electronics, low cost and plentiful enough to scatter like dust, sense the environment, communicate with each other, gather and process data, be an intelligence. The tiny nodes in smart dust are called motes. So the mote in the military's eye is a magnifying glass. The dust of history is still the dust of our histories, is a sign of what we've done and go on doing. Dust is a result of what we do. Our own devices. So this is coming to more closely to the device part. The digital epoch changes a lot, just as it also changes nothing in terms of the basic format of relations. We're asked to imagine the redundancy of humans in the face of digital machines and robots, but this redundancy is likely to be less a making invisible and more an increased visibility, where humans become underactive fleshiness or problems, recipients of phony universal basic incomes, consumers at any cost, because that is the rationale of the system. These humans, so say the proponents of platform capitalism, their critics as well as their boosters, these humans will exist in what they call digital silos, massive, enclosed, monopolistic platforms. Note how the name silo comes from a place in which bulk materials are stored, materials such as grain or sawdust. In this digital age, we have new machines that operate with new types of matter. These new machines can make anything. They use their digital clays to mould anything that can be imagined and things that have never been. New developments make it possible to model even viscous, semi-soft things. Currently, these modellings are slow as craft ever was. Digital plastics building up layer upon layer through wobbling nozzles, leaking thin and tiny blobs, tiny granules of thermoplastics or metal and wood filaments, which can remake everything that has ever existed in the world. This new craft seems crafty enough by itself to seem not to need humans. But perhaps what is also created, because the human will not go away just yet, is, to use a pun, a Kraftfeld, German for a force field, a relational electrical field, or a magnetic or gravitational one. A force field, which is a region of space around a body which, as with a charged particle, exerts a force on other bodies, including those not in contact with it. The digital devices, the digital machines, exude a force on us and across the whole of society. And sometimes we exert our force and touch them. But even when we're not touching, our worlds are still being reshaped and remade for us, because many devices are not at our fingertips, though by that point, perhaps they're no longer there for us, first and foremost. Now, a device is divisive in etymological terms. The word comes from the late 13th century Old French, derived from the Latin divisus, that which has been divided. When goods were being divided between people, a mark known as a device, which was a type of emblem, was put on each item to show whose was whose. A device is something that belongs to someone as an act of division. Of course, a device might also be literary, such as those devices a rhetorician, I can't say that word, someone who does rhetoric, or an author might employ to gain best effect or an advantage. Devices then are things that separate, divide, and mark out. And the divide poses a contradiction. Our gestures must be common enough to be read by the machine, but the machine is our device, our own one. We possess it as it possesses us. It's there to divide us into our own bubbles of social labour. We're also to be divided against ourselves, for our gestures are not ours. They belong to the machine. Liquid crystals facilitate them. Our gestures are corralled into simple flickings of switches on and off. Liquid crystals inhabit our devices, which proliferate. The device is everywhere. It does more and more. We've accommodated ourselves to the device or devices, especially to those that require our gestures and touches. Devices need us as we need them. Our bodies complete their circuits. Touch is what the device needs in order to function in a technical sense. Most touchscreens are either analog, using electrical resistance to sense its touches, or alternatively digital, using electrical capacitance. The human works in capacitance as a kind of conductor, and when the finger falls on a touchscreen composed of a grid of electrodes, a contact is formed, and the AC current of the device elicits from the user a corresponding current to complete a circuit. Some other body part, the hand on the back of the phone, the feet on the ground, electrically grounds the device. We work for the machine in touching it. The device captures our gestures through its microsensors. One press and the screen starts up. A few moments delay if it has been off. And then it responds to the fingertip, the knuckle, the tap, the flick, the swipe. Its surface is smooth and primed to respond. In turn, our fingertips become sensitized in new ways. Our fingers develop gestures not previously performed. Our touch sends liquid crystals down pathways to make things happen and trigger events. We and they learn a new gestural vocabulary. These gestures that we make towards our device make connections between us and between the events that are triggered on and through the screen. They connect, but they divide too. A device is a gadget, a vaguely defined technical thing that does something, usually by mechanical or electrical power. And some devices are known as suspect, like the one designed to rip through the air and brick at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984, which nearly killed Margaret Thatcher. A suspect device is the name for a bomb. This bomb shattered what was around it, as if the crystal of life that held together could be broken into so many parts. Its trigger was detonated by a long delay timer made from video cassette recorder components and a parking meter reminder signal called a memo park timer device. Nowadays, dumb or smartphones are the triggers for remote-controlled, improvised explosive devices in this gestural politics of terrorism. Liquid crystals have long been everywhere, in our bodies, in DNA, not least, but they were only named and probed and played with and set to work in the years following 1888, when investigations of their cloudy, turbid phase indicated a certain order at work, even if it was an unfamiliar order, for the cloudy phase has crystalline properties, though it is also fluid. The broken time of light contained in the liquid crystal conjures a kaleidoscope under polarized lenses. These forms can be engineered. The liquid crystal medium is makeable. For those who stuck over many years with this intermediate state, this interference in the conventional order of solid, liquid, and gas, there were more discoveries to be made, such as the realization in the 1930s that liquid crystals could be oriented by electrical fields. This allowed Radio Corporation of America to begin their research into how to use this responsiveness to make display technologies, ones in which wall pictures moved and mutated without rest. It's not the liquid crystal's polychromatous dazzle that provides the flitting colours on a liquid crystal display screen. Rather, a twisting pneumatic liquid crystal cell operates as a light shutter, rotating or not rotating the plane of polarization, depending on the application of voltage. The early LCD uses made this service function clearer, for they were only dark grey lozenges on the light grey gleam of a backdrop screen in a 1972 Gruen Teletime LCD watch, or the like. Liquid crystals found their way into display devices, and a massive industry dominated by Samsung, Sharp, LG Philips, Sony, and the rest developed. Liquid crystal in its thermotropic form holds life prisoner of the screen. The liquid crystals for many of these screens, the TVs, the computers, the tablets, the smartphones, projectors and cameras, are still synthesized there where their first scientist commissioned them in 1904 at Merck in Darmstadt, Germany. Here is an image of Merck's new factory for liquid crystal window modules in Veldhoven, Netherlands. On this liquid crystal earth, in these liquid crystal cities, the agitations of liquid crystals on screens are gazed at endlessly. Every window is now becoming a screen, a glass that can make itself cloudy in a trice when an electrical supply compels the liquid crystal molecules to randomly orient, scattering light, producing privacy, long dreamt of covertness. All our windows will be screens. All our screens are operating systems. The language of computing has reprogrammed the matter of life. The cities are luminous. We log on to them. Merck has to explore new uses for their most profitable output of liquid crystals, for rival technologies such as OLEDs are appearing and challenging the prominence of liquid crystals. So they make dimmable window panes or flat antennas on car roofs that electronically hone in on satellites. And this is a new window. Car manufacturers and industry analysts agree that vehicles will become entertainment centres. That concept starts with replacing windows with screens. Not only can the car's many cameras show you what is outside, but the view can be enhanced by augmented reality. The car can also deliver an immersive virtual reality. Intel and Warner Brothers are already collaborating to make in-car VR experiences the next evolution in movies. And then, of course, the shop enters the car in advertisement suggestions from the AI concierge for places to stop and buy en route. An AI-driven vehicle ceases to be just a vehicle. It can be anything. And as technology has transformed the concept of retail, it can transform a car ride into a shop on wheels, said Kiki Delval, Senior Vice President of Commerce for Every Device at MasterCard. The store is no longer beholden to its four walls. It's in your home office, where your desktop is. It's in your pocket, where your smartphone is. And now it'll be on the road. The device becomes the world. Each individual bubble of us exposed 24/7 to consuming, to the generation of pixel digital dust. If liquid and crystal is everywhere and well distributed, if it is our medium in which we float and bump, it should be evident that liquid and crystal have joined forces, at least metaphorically, with the other phase of matter, with gas, or clouds of gas, turbid, dusty, particulate clouds, perhaps emblematized in that contemporary device that's taken over so much, the vaping cigarette. Liquid and crystal align with the airy metaphorics of the cloud, where all information data sets arrives and all intelligence is exerted, not just in analyses, but in deep learning so that futures may be predicted and in being predicted become actual. This cloud is a public cloud, or better, a resource for private corporations, governments, and the surveillance industry. A wad of ever-expanding unstructured data, pixels of apprehensible content. If one thinks about the cloud, it encompasses you, and then you're in fog, the aerated dust of pixels, not just the fog of the urban particular or particulate, that fog of pollution, bad air, atmospheric gases suffused with particles of dust. Not the fog of too much moisture on the land. The fog that surrounds us now is an all-encompassing atmosphere in which nothing can be seen, mapped, or communicated, at least not for us. I'm speaking not just of the fog of tear gas, whose profits are surely soaring currently. It's another dusty cloud, or a cloud thick with digital dust. The fog of computing that makes us blind in some ways, but our many devices not. And the fog, in computing terms, is this new phenomenon, this new nature or third nature, like Ruskin's storm cloud of the 19th century, his plague cloud, black cloud, which he said was a new natural phenomenon but brought about by social, moral, and economic forces. The fog of fog computing is being worked on in our environs as cities adopt the protocols of smart cities, smart infrastructure, services, data collection and analysis. The Internet of Things all swirled in a soup of intelligence, hyped as if it were like the primal one that cooked up a plasma that became human. Liquid, crystal and gas combine to form a turbid medium through which we pass, in which we try to breathe, the turbid digital environment of the device. In invoking here sand and dust and liquid crystal and gases, I've been foregrounding matter, the liquids, crystals and gases of digital capitalism and the age of the device. Matter is constant, contemporary, it has its past, it has its present and its future. But it seems as if types of matter have their moment. How quaint some old matter, such as clay, might seem in the age of plastics, of throwaway plastic containers that pile up as toxic mountains and seep into the ground and sea. The thrown stuff that is clay might seem like the good and pretty sister of the evil one, who's thrown away but never disappears. Ernst Bloch, long ago in the years of the First World War, wrote about an old pitcher, a dark brown, clumsy jug with a face on it. And he imagined himself inside that jug, inside its belly. Bloch wonders what it looks like inside the dark and spacious belly. He says he'd like to occupy that space, just as a child might actually sneak inside a large vase out of curiosity. Bloch treasured the cloddish and crude, the brown, heavy, inhabitable Bartmann jug. Here's a quote from him that I forgot to write up on a slide, so I'll just read it. Whoever looks long enough at the picture soon begins to carry its colour and form with him. Not every puddle I step in makes me grey, not every railroad track bends me round a corner, but I could probably be formed like the picture, see myself as something brown, something peculiarly organic, some Nordic amphora, and not just mimetically or simply empathetically, but so that I thus become, for my part, richer, more present, cultivated further toward myself by this artifact that participates in me. That is true of all things that have grown. And here, in drinking pictures, the people laboured to express their pleasure and their deeper sense of contentment, to affix themselves to these implements of the household and the public house. Everything that was ever made in this way, out of love and necessity, leads a life of its own, leads into a strange new territory, and returns with us formed as we could not be in life, adorned with a certain, however weak, sign, the seal of ourself. End of quote. So for Bloch, it's as if the jug grows like a plant grows, and a self might be sent inside it, into its form, and that self becomes externalized in its form. This jug is a product of labour. It takes its place within a culture of use. Selves are expressed through it, the maker's self, the user's self, but it leads a life of its own, and it leads us. But we're made with it in this journey. We are, Bloch thinks, made through and of that clay. We are a mud, composed of weathered granite rock, of decomposed feldspar, drawing water into a crystal structure. We are golems. He was the jug. Can we, today, be the Tetra Pak? Can we be the coffee bar cappuccino cup? These things arrive with us from far away and do not seem to contain us. Tetra Pak makes, or made, began with little pyramids of milk, still makes some of them, as well as colourful packages of juice. It sells these across the world. It's long done so. It now understands its mission to be embodied in the shape of the container that it invented in 1952. This sterile, regular, and rigid container. Its corporate strategy is titled Deeper into the Pyramid, and it aims to deliver milk to ever lower layers of the social pyramid in its pyramids. To those poorest people, those who might once have had a cow and the hands to milk it, were they not now to be persuaded that such old practices are unhygienic? These poorest people are projected to remain poor, but a little of something from a lot of people can add up to a lot, and so these bodies will receive pyramids of low-value milk derivative. This is the world of industrial globalized capitalism, which has remade things from the bottom up. Every practice, every process, every hand that is now not a set of fingers curling and uncurling around udders or pots, but rather electrical conduits on touchscreen interfaces triggering micro events, or people undoing plastic pyramids. Technologies are badged nowadays as aseptic, clean and green, yet the rubbish piles grow higher and higher. Do we know these new vessels to be our enemy now, for they're marked as destroying our seas and our planet? We're not asked to curl up inside them. Sometimes the foam on a cappuccino turns sculptural. Now it is the microfoam or froth in which our forms are sculpted or painted. We can order, apparently, a selfie-chino, self-portraits in froth offered by an upmarket coffee bar, an image of customers' faces on the foamy topping of their drinks. Patrons send their headshots via an online messaging app to the barista and are given a choice of cappuccino or hot chocolate as their canvas. These seem to be an emblem of our evanescent social form or foam. We, proximate bubbles, jostling, not really touching, are moments of meeting brief and fragile. Froths and foams are a nothingness held in time together and sold high in the case of coffee, or productive of toxicity in the case of frothy pollution foams, such as those that course periodically through Hyderabad or New Delhi, the result of phosphate detergents and cosmetic waste gushing into rivers, turning them softly solid. What matter and what states of matter do we deserve? And to return to dust, it doesn't go away. Nothing goes away. But it might come to resonate or act upon us differently in different times. Matter is currently in the process of reinvention. It always is, perhaps. There are now new clays that are a byproduct of contemporary production. In China, there can be found vast lakes consisting of a slow flow of sludge, of mud and sand and minerals, a radioactive clay that comes there as waste from the rare earth mineral refining factories. These lakes contain tailings or substances left behind once ore has had its economically valuable parts stripped out, and the leftover settles in mud, which prevents the toxic tailings from dispersing on the wind, taking their dust into populated areas. Some photographs of these these lakes have used the quality of particular lights to tease a glistening glow from the murky quagmire, which mirrors its relation, the sheeny plastic of a smartphone's casing. This sludgy pond hosts the remainder from the chemicals that provide the underside of the liquid crystal touchscreen, the coating that monitors changes in electric state on the screen, and is composed of rare earth minerals and metals, highly conductive ones that can be easily deposited on the glass as a film. We pulverize matter, we process it, we bind it into buildings, we use it up and throw it away. Our dream worlds pulverize matter. Our digital dream worlds, that is. CGI photography tutorials abound with techniques for making it seem as if objects float, defying gravity. The anti-physics that modernism and the cartoons alike once proposed turns into a weird or non or fake physics of the liquid crystal epoch. Yves Klein made a leap into the void in 1960 through the trickery of analog photo montage. Two photos printed together, one without tarpaulin. The photograph was a hinge as much as it was a record of gravity. The photograph was the playful interruption of gravity, but also a kind of record of it. In Photoshop, of course, the outputs are easier to obtain. Photography is the vehicle through which matter is managed in CGI, and all shall float. Let's see if I can get this moving. It's a little, not very good at doing this. Oops. Oh, okay. We can let that run. Can we turn the sound down?
Let go of whichever
There's a video by Ravana Neuschwander and Karl Jumaez, The Tenant from 2010, which shows a bubble floating and never bursting as it floats endlessly through a house. And of course, that's courtesy of computer magic. So I wondered if it's only in the art world that a bubble might float differently. But here we have a bubble of water floating in space and also moving differently than on Earth. Microgravity means that the fluid can bounce and wander in ways impossible in our environment due to surface tension dynamics, lack of buoyancy, and sedimentation within fluids in a low-gravity environment. So this is NASA scientists using the space bubble's capacity to move in this strange way, but also to swallow and hold a GoPro 4K camera. This water bubble starts to look back at us. The NASA scientists are gleaning information about microgravity and its operations as camera looks at camera. They found the 3D camera that they used was superior to other cameras. Small radiation particles penetrate usual camera sensors and burn out the pixels inside the liquid crystal device, showing up as white dots on the images sent back to Earth. This didn't happen with the 3D camera. Its semiconductor was less susceptible to radiation. So a certain device was tangled up with the environment differently. What environment do our devices discern for us, and in ways far, far beyond the capacity of the eye? There are, for example, continuous efforts to photograph or image atoms. To capture them in all their presence as tiny solid balls, as our building blocks, such that they might then be made to yield to the liquefying pressures of radicality or transformability, as are undergone in the science fictional labs of MIT and elsewhere. At MIT, scientific speculators dream of third nature, a design nature which proposes a seemingly magical or nightmarish world that exists as a result of highly capitalized infrastructures. And at its more fantastical ends, it provides extraordinary images of the world remade from the atom up according to the digital command, riffing on that quote from Ivan Sutherland from 1965, when he imagined a room in which computers could control the existence of matter. The extension of this vision is the idea of the whole world, of each particle in our world infused by liquid crystal digital prowess. The idea of radical atoms, as promulgated at MIT by Hiroshi Ishii and the Tangible Media Group, thinks about a world passed through digitization in which every atom that we use, or every atom that comprises the new matter that we make, is able to be manipulated digitally. The bleeding edge of technology is the prospect of technology not just on the body, at the fingertips or on the skin, not just on the screens and in the multiple devices around us, but integrated into every atom of the world, each atom whose capacities are augmented so that they might account for phases from fixed to flowing, from liquid to crystal. The height of this imagination, a digital interface implanted directly in the eyeball, not only augmenting the bejeweled surface of what it sees with data feeds, but exerting the ability to shape-shift what it looks at through the energy of thought. Photography melds with seeing, which melds with shaping, and the subperceptual is brought into the realm of digital image, even if only as a blurry grey emanation from an electron microscope, or a pale blue dot that purports to be the image of an atom, but is actually its quivering reflection in light. In this image from 2018, a single strontium atom is illuminated by a laser while suspended in the air by two electrodes caught within a strong electrical field. The two electrodes on each side of the tiny dot are 2 millimeters apart. When lit by a laser of the right blue-violet colour, the atom absorbs and re-emits light particles sufficiently quickly to be captured in a long exposure from a camera fitted with an extension tube, increasing the focal length of the lens. The diameter of a strontium atom is a few millionths of a millimeter. Here it expands beyond itself in the light, or in the many light beams over time, which excite its orbiting electrons and make them energized to give off light. Time bleeds into an image. The image bleeds out as a kind of confusion, an impression, presented as a fact, a single trapped atom, as if an atom might be trapped, as if it is an atom we see, as if so many encumbrances were not surrounding it. Those electrons, ambivalent between dot and wave, fixed point and fluid skid, were in permanent movement, impossible to observe without changing. As a melee, a crowd, a turbid or turbid buzz, in their multiplicity, recorded over long durations, their tracks might be traced and made visible, as if it were one singular moment in an atom's life. But what we actually see is the device's capacities to communicate to us. to pretend to show us the tiniest dust of atoms that can be harnessed so that this ailing world can be remade. We all, in our excursions through cities, mingle with the turbulent activity of particles in a cloud. We are the cloud. We carry it with us. We communicate with it even when we do not know we are. We make digital dust. We are digital dust. We are a crowd of particles, human dust whirled up. Our clods of puffed up thoughts and opinions float around, come to land, whirl up again. These clouds of dust form crowds of thought. They spread across environments like toxic gases. They make atmosphere. They change atmospheres. We live our lives through matter, and it lives through us. We're locked in relationships designed by ourselves and others, and sometimes these relationships seem fatal. Our matter, the way in which our lives are now designed, our lives, unsustainable. Every smallest part of what we do, touch, trigger, is under the microscope whose lens is made of sand, made of glass. Sometimes, though, things evade us. Glass has the capacity to be sick, to have glass illness or glass disease. Such glass, a sickly glass, degrading, can weep from its glassy eyes that must be windows to its glass soul. The sickly glass may contain, in the manner of flaws, a subtle but stunning beauty in its instabilities, its crizzling, its spalling, its cracking, all dependent on the particularities of its chemical composition, its types and proportions of silica and alkalis in its sand. In the byways of the internet, I read of glass surfaces on the Solar Probe Plus spacecraft as it undertook a 7-year orbit with a perihelion distance of less than 10 solar radii, sending back images of the sun to Earth. The device was exposed to interplanetary dust particle hypervelocity impacts, or micrometeoroid flux. This led to surface spalling on the glass parts of the probe, which undermined the science return from the mission because of reflected light losses. Here are communications of another type, of dust to sand to glass, whose design escapes us, a relation which we cannot always control. Might that be so bad? These communications come to us through our devices. They may be illegible. They propose at least something outside of the tight circuits of devices, capital, extraction, instrumentalization. What dust is it? As cosmic dust, is it to be bound into the cycles of eternal return, or might it be emblem of another possibility of historical development? And if its signals could signal differently, might we apprehend it with devices that are not divisive, a matter that matters in another way? This talk has been about the ways in which matter proposes, promises, threatens, and dreams through us, overspills into us. And I wanted only to bring that to light, to think about how it mobilizes us and we it, as might an artist, so giving images or condensations, refusing to separate out the metaphorical and the actual, the virtual and the present, nature and culture, or design and accident. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Esther. Well, we have just a few minutes. That was a
bit long.
rather watertight and talk. But if there are any questions, now we could perhaps open it up. Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm wondering if not just geological but also biological dust, so the kind of dust left off cells and skin from human beings, if that kind of dust might figure into your poetics and politics of matter, and specifically dust, as you said, as a result of what we do. And whether that kind of dust, this biological dust, maybe doesn't in return do the same kind of things that the geological dust, the kind of extract from the earth, does for us?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, because I suppose in some ways, I think the early slide I showed is of sort of human skin dust, and presumably if one lives with animals, so that sort of biological dust. And I suppose when I think of that, that's what I imagine. Like Georges Bataille's, thinking about human shedding in some way when he's so effusive about dust and what it will cover up in a sort of anti the kind of cleanliness of modernity, thinking of it as a sort of disruption of the smooth passage of things. And I suppose I wonder if that's also kind of the dust of Duchamp and so I'm wondering if that makes me think much more of sort of 1920s dust in some sort of sense for some reason. But I suppose I'm drawn to these other dusts because I've got this idea of a kind of toxicity, and I suppose human dust, biological dust, I guess, can produce effects. I don't know if asthmatics would, is that a response to human dust in the environment? I suppose it's mainly pollens and such, which is another kind of biological dust. Again, I was thinking of Marcel Proust and sort of taking all these powders in order to counteract the effect of his sickliness from pollens, and yet at the same time refusing to have any of his house dusted because either he enjoyed the dust or he didn't want his things touched by others. It also brings up all the stuff around sort of servants.
Yeah, I'd like to speak about some theological dust. Have you ever thought of Genesis 3:19? Because it actually gave the material proof to the story of the tree of knowledge. For you are dust, and to dust you will return.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is true. Well, and I think that's there when I sort of, if I say we are dust, and it's almost like everything is doubled. So we will return to dust, and we are made of dust, and we produce
It's
dust.
all written down in scripture already.
Yeah, it's true. And also I had the mote in one's eye, think about the beam in your own eye kind of thing. But there's this kind of digital doubling because we also generate this whole digital tracking of our existence, which is always becoming dust, and hence the sort of ambivalence of that Facebook thing. Oh, we can use this dust, but then at the same time it's just this accumulation of stuff that perhaps it can't be monetized, or perhaps it's just going to clog up the system, and in that sense it's dead, so what kind of life and death exists both in our dust and in the sort of digital dust we're producing.
I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on your own dust, your rhetorical and linguistic dust, as you make emendations and gestures, as you write and speak to us, and also the kind of rhythms, the particles of your speech, as you have constructed this talk.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm capable of reflecting on it. I mean, I know I want to. There are moments when I'm very conscious of it going into a kind of storytelling or mythic sort of mode, and I suppose I do everything I can. I don't necessarily know why, but to evade a traditional kind of academic address, because I have this sense in which I think for every person there will be parts that are meaningful, which will take them on their own set of associations and journeys. So it's less of a kind of telling and more of producing of a kind of atmosphere. In a sense, it's sort of thick, with all my particles and my pointers, but it's also meant to produce something slightly dream-like, which means you might engage with it in a less concentrated way, perhaps.
You talked about atmosphere a couple of times, and which obviously atmosphere is one of those terms that's very difficult to define since it's used in so many metaphorical ways. But could I ask you to maybe say something about how you felt devices create an atmosphere around them that might be maybe not more specific, but give us a bit more concrete to what atmosphere might be in that sense.
I got very interested in atmosphere in a variety of ways, and I got very intrigued by this quote from a speech that Marx makes in 1860, where he's reflecting on the coming of the bourgeois revolutions in Europe, and this idea that you could feel it, and he's very excited with the science of the time, where they're measuring atmosphere and they're understanding all these things. So he's talking about this kind of palpable build-up of sort of, I suppose, of that you could feel something in the air politically was going to change. And this came back to me when I was thinking about a rather negative version of this, which was the British Home Office policy under Theresa May a few years ago. It still exists, a government policy to generate a hostile environment. And for me, environment is a kind of atmosphere. So you generate an atmosphere in which people are made to feel unwelcome. So people who don't have right to remain in the UK will just leave, and arguably Brexit is a sort of extension of that. You just manipulate the atmosphere. So without having to do physical measures, you just make people want to leave. So it's partly, I'm interested in the way in which atmospheres can be, not just how they're produced, but or how they can be sort of manipulated, or how they're kind of generated, and in the ways in which social media feeds into this, and that one image, I got very interested in that image of Melania Trump with the Zara "I really don't care" coat on, how that can be sort of recirculated and then sort of unleashes the ability to make certain things sayable that weren't before. The atmosphere becomes changed. You get lots of instances of this. So I think I'm interested in that 19th century Gabrielle Tard sort of crowd analysis stuff, where they talk about contagion, and that all came back during Occupy movement, where people were talking again about sort of contagion model of spreading ideas and spreading sort of revolutionary or critical sensibilities. So it's about political atmospheres, but it's also about our environment, and quite literally about toxicity and pollution, and whether we can still breathe the air that surrounds us. And then I suppose in a micro sense, it's about if an atmosphere is a sort of a kind of relational figure for us sort of moving closer to our devices, sort of coming into the ambit of these force fields. I suppose it's a kind of atmosphere for me in which you then trigger events or become bound up in other people's monitoring or device-driven sort of use. So I think there's lots of ways in which atmosphere sort of comes in and out, but often bound to notions of environment, I guess.
And when you talk about there are threads of visibility and mediation, And I can't help but think of the act of cleaning and what you would say about cleaning. And in some cases where dust actually makes something more visible than it does invisible. So I'm just curious for you what cleaning it really entails, the removal of dust or, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I start with this thing about sort of dust might make outlines more visible, but not the substance. But I mean that can make things more noticeable, I suppose, because they're covered in this layer of dust. But I suppose I'm very much driven. Walter Benjamin's always coming back to this idea of sleeping beauty, which has been asleep for 100 years, and all the dust has sort of settled, and it's as if nothing has happened, history has stopped, and to sort of intervene into that just implies this great modernist kind of sweep out, and where we get rid of all of that, and history and progress can start again. But of course, from an Adornian point of view, that sweeping out is a kind of lie, or brings its own problems with it, or doesn't acknowledge the persistence, I suppose, of mythic frameworks. So I'm not sure I want some kind of industrial cleaning and it's all wiped away, because I think for me that dust, it is evidence, it is history. I've been really influenced recently by the work of forensic architecture, A.L. Weisman and Susan Shipley and others at Goldsmiths, and A.L. is always talking about devilish dust, and he's got this great, what forensic architects do is they take on cases for various organisations. They're doing a police investigation in relation to a police shooting in Chicago. They've done a lot of work in Gaza, working around police crimes in London and elsewhere. They just take all the images that they can find and they analyse them and try and produce. I always say it's a truth of what actually happened. Did the policeman shoot first? What was this? They're reconstructing the perspective of someone who was killed in a police shooting to change the notion of the perspective of evidence. But there's one case in Israel where a particular type of bomb had dropped, and they reconstruct the whole scene, and they look at a press conference and notice one little moment where a military official just gives the game away through a little accident. So it's a bit like the Freudian kind of return of the repressed. We betray ourselves, but Ale calls it the dust falls off it, that someone will always betray themselves. And for him, this dust falls off, it's these tiny particulars, and that is evidence, and you can analyse that, and through that dust you find the truth, because this is evidence of process, of activity. So he's using it sort of metaphorically, but also actually. Susan Shipley writes an extraordinary essay about the World Trade Center, analysing the dust produced in the World Trade Center destruction. And so, I think dust is important, and it will always be there. So I guess it's not about getting rid of it. In a way, it's about taking it more seriously as kinds of evidence that then tell us more about ourselves and our worlds, I guess. But I'd like to get rid of the toxic stuff.
Could you say something more about Adorno's view of dust? I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, I don't know. It was more Adorno's view of enlightenment, I suppose, in this. There is. I had this line here about how the military mote in the eye is a magnifying glass, and that was actually a deliberate misquoting of Adorno's "the splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass." So I think he's probably more at home talking about glass than dust, maybe.
Enlightenment wants to sweep the dust away.
Yeah, exactly. But Adorno
It's
will
just
say,
small. That's the dialectics.
yeah, and Adorno will say, well, you know, it's you can't sweep it away, or it's, you know, it's super rationality is just its own set of mythic presumptions, or you know that it's not what it purports to be. So you know, capitalism is still is fetishistic in the most so-called primitive of ways. So it's always this flip around.
Well, we're past the half hour, and I think if you want to take up anything more, we can do that outside over a glass of wine. But please join me in thanking Esther.